All right, hello. Hope you're all doing well. So this video is going to be about the nervous system, and more specifically, it's mostly going to be about the efferent nervous system, and I'll get into the terminology in a second. We're primarily going to be talking about autonomics, and the reason is because this was something that was difficult for me, and I feel that if I'm able to give you guys a good framework of what's going on before you start getting into the weeds with your cardiology course and the rest of your courses throughout medical school, at least you'll have that organization in your mind and it'll be a little less confusing. And so there are a couple different ways to organize the nervous system. And we'll go through one way that is kind of presented in the cardiology block. And hopefully it makes sense. So essentially the reason is to create a metacognitive framework. So what is metacognition? So metacognition is essentially knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And so that means that if you're given a topic, that you will know all of the subjects that you know, of course, and then for the subjects that you don't know, you will have an organization of what the material is, but you might not necessarily know the content of those subjects. And so the purpose of this is to give you a metacognitive framework so that you know that everything exists and you have everything organized in your brain. And so as you go out through medical school, learning more about the nervous system, learning more about the sympathetic and parasympathetic, et cetera, you can fill in those buckets in your brain. That's how I like to think about it. So a lot of this might be review for you guys who took physiology in undergrad, but it will be relevant to your medical school. And some of the topics will be things that you've covered in the foundations block, and there will be some pretty basic stuff. So hopefully you can keep up, and it shouldn't be too confusing. So with that, let's get started. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen here. And this is all of the stuff that we are going to go through. And there will be timestamps down in the description, so feel free to jump around if you feel like the introduction is too introductory for you. This is essentially the table of content. So we're going to go through a little introduction, what I expect you to know. I'm going to try and start from the bare minimum, totally basics, and then we're going to go on into what are nerves, signaling, how can we divide up the nervous system, and then sympathetic and parasympathetic. So where these lie in the broader scheme of the nervous system. Cranial nerves, what they are, spinal cord tracts, some receptor stuff, and then how all of this plays a part in organ systems. So without further ado, let's get started. So first thing in the introduction, what I'd like you to know is three main things. One is cells are dumb. And the reason I say that is because cells basically just respond to signals. And so this might be a signal coming from the nucleus, or it might be a signal that was floating around outside and then came and told the cell to do something. Cells are dumb. They're not going to do anything on their own volition, and they are just going to respond to signals, whether that be internal or external. The second thing is that there's an inside world and an outside world for every cell. Again, you can see that this is separated by the cell membrane. So there's outside stuff and inside stuff. And the concept of homeostasis is essentially keeping these two worlds apart while keeping the situation inside in a particular range of ions, particular range of pH, etc. And so the cell needs to maintain itself in some sort of equilibrium so that it doesn't explode if it's put in a fluid, or if your blood pH changes or something like that. So it needs to be able to adapt, and the membrane is what keeps the inside apart from the outside. And so all of the cells in your body, everything in your body is made up of cells, and all of the cells in your body have a membrane to keep the inside world and the outside world apart. And so the final little concept building off of that is that there are things on the cell surface. And this could be anything. And this is how the cell interacts with the outside world. So we have a cell in the nucleus. And then in the cell membrane, you're going to have some channels. You're going to have some receptors. You're going to have other proteins and stuff floating around. These can be a whole host of things. And so just like zooming in right here, if we look at what these things can be, and this is stuff that you probably are familiar with, there are going to be some ATPases, kind of like the sodium potassium pump, that let things in and let things out. Bidirectional transporters. You're going to have unidirectional transporters or uniporters. You're going to have channels for passive transport. You're going to have, voltage gated ion channels, like calcium channels. You can have a whole bunch of things. In terms of receptors, you could have something like a GPCR, hopefully I can spell at 8 in the morning. GPCRs, you can have RTKs. Essentially, all these different words that you'll see throughout medical school are just receptors that are sitting in the cell membrane. And what they do is when something comes along like this, it'll go and attach on here. And then the receptor will tell the cell to do something. Maybe it'll say, hey, transcribe this. Or maybe it'll phosphorylate something and activate something. But it's a cell surface receptor, and it's letting that inside world interact with the outside world. All right? So that's the introduction. Hopefully all that made sense. And we will move on to the next part. So now we'll go on to neurons and nerves. And so we have a good idea, basic idea of what a cell is. It's a dumb thing that kind of just does what it's told, does not really do things on its own volition. So what is a neuron? A neuron is a nerve cell. And a lot of times you'll see it drawn like this. All right, you'll have a long bit. And signals will be sent along the neuron from one end to the other. And from there, it can pass on to another neuron, right? That neuron is going to continue sending the signal. I'm not going to get into the details of cell signaling, or at least neuronal signaling. Or it can, go and instead of telling another nerve to do something, it can tell a muscle to do something, right? So maybe this is a muscle, and it says, hey, muscle contract, right? So it can do a whole bunch of things. The neuron is the basic cell unit of a nerve. And so what is, so when this goes and attaches onto something else and tells something else to do something, that is called a synapse. And so when you have attachment between this guy and another nerve, this is called a synapse. You can also have an effector junction. So let me get into that terminology really quickly. So effector. Effector means the site you are going to go and affect, right? Or I guess the site you're going to go and affect. The effector is where you're going to go and have your effect. And so that can be a muscle, it can be an organ, and the terminology for this is neuro effector junction. So let's say that the first nerve goes and synapses onto your heart, right? Right here, where this guy releases his neurotransmitters and that goes and acts on the heart, this is going to be called the neuroeffector junction, sometimes shortened to NEJ. Specifically for muscles, it'll be called the neuromuscular junction. Hopefully you're not falling asleep just yet. I know some of this is super basic. And this will be shortened to NMJ. And so maybe this will synapse onto your skeletal muscle somewhere. What a beautiful picture of muscle. Okay, so we kind of know what a synapse is. We kind of see these effector sites, neuroeffector junctions, neuromuscular junctions. So then what is a nerve? A nerve is pretty diverse, and keep your mind open when you start thinking about nerves. I always thought of nerves as very monolithic, but that's not the case. A single nerve, any nerve in the body, so this can be a spinal nerve, aka a nerve exiting your spinal cord, or it can be any of the other nerves going throughout your thorax, or a nerve going down the stretch of your leg. This one nerve, so this one string that you'll see in anatomy, this one string, this can transmit information up or down. It's bidirectional. So it can do sensory information up, or it can do motor or effector information down. This can also do both, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to do just one of those, and it can do it in both ways. It can also do somatic, which means voluntary. And so this is usually skeletal muscle. Or it can do autonomic, which means involuntary, which is all the stuff that you don't think about. One nerve can do all of these different things. And so keep in mind that a nerve is just a chain of neurons. So if this is a neuron simplified from the little schematic above, a nerve could be maybe 3 of these neurons in series. And so this guy sends a signal across it. There's a synapse here. And then this one sends a signal, 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 another synapse, signal, signal, signal. And then maybe it ends at a neuromuscular junction or something like that. And then there's a muscle and it tells your biceps to contract. It can also have a thing going in the other way. And maybe it's sending this. Or maybe it has another one that is also going in this direction. A nerve is basically just a superhighway of all of these neurons that are sending signals in different directions. It could be in multiple directions. It could all just be in one direction. The nerve is just a highway that allows for all of this information to pass. It can be a bundle of different neuronal pathways. So when you see a nerve in anatomy, let's say you see the vagus nerve or something that starts up in the cranial region, then it wanders down. That's vagal, comes from the I don't remember if it's Greek or Latin, but things like vagabond, vagrant, which means wandering. And it wanders down the body. And that nerve can send some effector, some muscular motor information, and then it can also send some autonomic information down, right? So it's doing all of these different things. That one string that we see in anatomy can be doing all of these different things. And so don't think of a nerve as, okay, that nerve goes from here to there and does that one thing. It could be sending information back. It could be doing a whole bunch of things, right? And so when we have information that is going away from the brain, we said it goes to the effector, and this can also be known as efferent information. So something going away is known as efferent. Something going towards is known as afferent. Hopefully you can read my handwriting. So we have afferent information. So this is usually sensory stuff going towards the brain. Again, this can be voluntary or involuntary. And then we have efferent stuff. This is usually motor stuff, but this can also be to glands and other things that you're not thinking about in your body. And this is going away from your brain, right? So you have afferent information going towards your brain. This is your brain and spinal cord, and efferent information going away. And so afferent, efferent, you'll kind of hear that terminology again in renal when you hear about the afferent arteriole bringing blood, arterial blood, to the glomerulus, which is the filtering unit of the kidney, and then leaving will be the efferent arteriole. So it's going towards, going away. Afferent and efferent. So nerve can do all of these different things, okay? And the nerve basically has an electrical signal that goes along it, and it'll send a signal from point A to point B. And this can be motor or sensory, and maybe it'll synapse onto muscle, maybe it'll synapse onto organ, maybe it'll synapse onto other nerves, etc. Right? Hopefully all that made sense. That's basically neuron and nerva. I checked it off already. So let's move on to the divisions of the nervous system now. So we'll start off with this. So we spoke about afferent and efferent, right? And so you can have one nerve doing both of these, afferent and efferent. But as a conceptual division, we'll divide up the nervous system into the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So peripheral nervous system, also known as PNS, and then central nervous system, also known as CNS. So the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves that are not part of the CNS. And what is the CNS? This is going to be your brain, your brainstem, and your spinal cord. So it's all these guys in the center right here. You have your brain, your brainstem, and then your spinal cord. And then there are also going to be some interneurons here. So interneurons are going to do a little bit of integration on their own, and these can lie anywhere inside the central nervous system. And so when we're looking at afferent, efferent, that's going to be peripheral nervous system. So this is nerves coming off of the central nervous system. So if we take a look at this, this is all the nerves in your body, okay? And this is what I mean by metacognition. Now you can kind of categorize all the nerves in your body. Some of them are going to be afferent, Some of them are going to be efferent, so sending information out. Some of them are going to be doing both of those. Some of them are going to be in the peripheral nervous system, and some of them are going to be in the central nervous system. All right. So when we're talking about these divisions of the nervous system, we can divide it up by afferent and efferent. We can also divide it up as autonomic, meaning involuntary, or somatic, meaning voluntary. And the reason this division is also valuable is because this is where we start getting into the sympathetic and parasympathetic stuff. So this is central nervous system, this is peripheral nervous system, and this is peripheral nervous system. And so afferent, we're going to have some voluntary, which is somatic, and involuntary, which is autonomic. And then efferent, we're also going to have voluntary, which is somatic, and involuntary, which is autonomic. And let's think for a second about what these functions would be. So if we're looking at a voluntary somatic efferent, what do you think that's going to be? That's going to be your skeletal muscle. Okay, voluntary movement that is motor, efferent, leaving the central nervous system. It's going to be skeletal muscle. That's the stuff that you can think consciously and move around. Involuntary effectors, so efferent, leaving the central nervous system. Involuntary stuff. This is going to be things like, glands, digestion, all the things that you're not consciously thinking about. Maybe you do consciously think about your digestion. Who knows? But this is going to be your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. How about these? Voluntary afferents and involuntary afferents. So your voluntary afferents are things that you consciously feel, right? And so this is going to be sensory stuff, such as pain, touch, temperature, etc. Things that you consciously feel. And this is all afferent information going back to your brain. Involuntary autonomics, it's all of the sensory stuff that's going back to your brain, all of the afferent information going back towards your brain that you don't really think about. So there's going to be a lot of stuff. And so the focus of this presentation is primarily going to be over here. All right, so let's zoom in on this a little more. So we said we start off with PNS versus CNS, and we're primarily talking about peripheral nervous system. We have afferent, which is going towards the CNS, and then we have efferent, which is going away, and this is primarily motor, but not necessarily motor neurons and not necessarily skeletal muscle. The efferents can be divided up into our voluntary and our involuntary. Hopefully you're with me until there. And quiz yourself real quick. What is voluntary also called? Somatic. And involuntary is also called? Autonomic. All right. So now we know where we're at. We're talking about the peripheral nervous system, so not the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. It's the stuff leaving the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. We're not talking about the information going back towards the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. We're talking about the efferents going away. And so the stuff going away can be either voluntary, things we consciously think about, or involuntary. So now we know that, so we have some voluntary information leaving, and we have some involuntary information leaving. So the voluntary information leaving, we already said, is going to be our skeletal muscle, right? So it's going to be the information that goes down to our skeletal muscle. The involuntary information, this is going to be our sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we can divide this up. And our sympathetic. Hopefully you can read that. Okay, so now we have a division here. And so how do we start determining? So all of this stuff is going to be stuff that we don't think about. So how can we organize this a little further? Well, a lot of times these nerves are divided up based on what the neurotransmitter is at the effector site, so at the final site of effect. And so this can actually be divided up into cholinergic and adrenergic. So cholinergic and adrenergic. So cholinergic comes from acetylcholine being the neurotransmitter. And you'll see me and a lot of people shorten this as ACH. Adrenergic comes from adrenaline, which in the autonomic nervous system we'll refer to as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine. So these are the two, oh geez, there goes the spelling. Norepinephrine. So these are the two adrenergic neurotransmitters that we will see at the effector sites. All right, so if we're going to divide things up by that, how it goes is, let's move this over. If we're going to divide things up like that, how it's going to look is the parasympathetics, the somatics, and some of the sympathetics are going to be cholinergic at the effector site. So all of these are going to be cholinergic. You're going to have some sympathetics that are adrenergic. Adrenergic. And so these are all peripheral nerves, right? So nerves that are starting off in your central nervous system, but leaving efferent information that is going to go onto voluntary sites such as skeletal muscle and then involuntary sites. And so really quickly, where are these going to go? So your parasympathetics is going to go to smooth muscle glands, etc. Your sympathetics also, it's going to go to smooth muscle glands, etc. One sympathetic target is actually your adrenal medulla. And so I'm going to identify that right here real quick. This is your adrenal medulla. And your adrenal medulla is a tiny little organ that sits atop your kidneys. You'll see that in anatomy. And its job is actually to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so you have a sympathetic nerve that goes and synapses onto the adrenal medulla, which synapses onto the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla in turn will produce mostly epinephrine, but also a little bit of norepinephrine. So here we're going to get mostly epinephrine and a little bit of norepinephrine. Here we're going to be doing mostly norepinephrine. And then when we get to the cholinergic side, these are all going to be acetylcholine. All right. So this is starting to look a little more like your favorite figure that you guys will see in the cardiology block, which is essentially the divisions of the autonomic, the efferent nervous system. So this is a little bit of a lie because I left out some details here. So let's go through those details real quick. These systems are not actually one nerve systems. Usually they're two nerve systems, sometimes three nerve systems, which means that they're going to have some synapses, right? You're going to have one nerve synapsing onto another nerve. And between two nerves, there also needs to be some sort of neurotransmitter. Well, you can also have a nerve-to-nerve signal that is sent via gap junction. But specifically here, we're going to be talking about nerve-to-nerve that synapses with synapses, and then you get a neurotransmitter that sends the information from one nerve to the next nerve for that nerve to continue the signaling. So all of these are going to have at least one of those. And the location at which this happens, I'll talk about that in a second. So your somatic nerves, your somatic efferent nerves, the neurotransmitter in between is glutamate. For the rest of them, they're all going to be, they're all going to be acetylcholine. So you're going to have acetylcholine here, you're going to have acetylcholine here, and you're going to have acetylcholine here. And remember what that means. You're going to have a synapse, right, onto another nerve, right? That's one nerve, that's another nerve. And it's going to release these neurotransmitters out of the very end of the neuron. And it's going to go, and remember, cells are dumb, they're just going to do what they're told. And so this guy is going to have some receptors, or it's going to let these neurotransmitters go in. It's going to have some channels, something like that. And then this nerve is going, so this nerve is going to start the signal, and then it's going to release the neurotransmitter at the synapse. And then the next nerve is going to continue that signal. Right. All right. So we're going to have acetylcholine at all of these synapses. And we're going to have acetylcholine here as well. So lots of acetylcholine. All right. So the place at which you have a autonomic neuron that is synapsing onto the second autonomic neuron, that is called the ganglia. And the reason for that, I'll get into that in a second. So we've divided up the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And now let's look at this anatomically. And so right now we're kind of finishing up the divisions of the nervous system, and we're kind of going into what is sympathetic and what is parasympathetic. All right. So another way that this can be divided up is anatomically. And so the sympathetic nervous system is often known as the thoracolumbar division of the autonomic nervous system. And the reason is because you see here, it starts at T1 and then goes to L3. What that means is when it's exiting the spinal cord, remember this is part of the peripheral nervous system, leaving the brain brainstem spinal cord. The sympathetic nervous system is known as the thoracolumbar division. And that's because it exits the spinal cord. So again, information leaving, it's exiting or entering if it's sensory, but this is all efferent, T1 through roughly L3. Some people say L2. This textbook in particular says L3. And so you can see the information leaving here, and it's leaving anywhere between T. So let me explain that real quick. So when we're talking about the spinal cord, so this is your skull, and then these are all your vertebrae. A lot more vertebrae than that, but just as a schematic. And you're going to have a brain inside your skull, hopefully, and then you're going to have your spinal cord. Your brainstem is going to be right here, and then you're going to have your spinal cord, and then you're going to have all of your peripheral nerves, right, coming off of your spinal cord. It'll be attached. This is just a very bad drawing. And the divisions are based on your vertebral segments. So you're going to have some cranial nerves, which come off of your brainstem, cranial nerves. And I say come off of your brainstem, but they could also be sending sensory information back up as well, or solely sensory information back up. You're going to have some cranial nerves. You're going to have some in the cervical region. You're going to have some in the thoracic region. You're going to have some in the lumbar region, and you're going to have some in the sacral region. And so these are also going to be the divisions of your vertebrae down your spine. So you're going to have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and 5 sacral vertebrae. Some people say, oh, these are the times of day in which you eat at 7 a.m., noon, and then 5 p.m. I don't know who eats that regularly, but anyway. So cervical, you might recognize this from the word cervix in the uterus, and this is the neck of the uterus, and cervix means neck, and so that's why we have cervical vertebrae in our neck. So when someone says cervical cancer, they probably mean of the uterus and not of the neck. So now how these segments are named is the cervical segments will be named C1 through C7. And so sometimes you'll see, oh, that person has a C5 disc issue or C5, C6 disc issue. That means the disc, the little padding between vertebrae C5 and vertebrae number C6. All right, so then you're going to have T1 through T12, you're going to have L1 through L5, and then you're going to have S1 through S5. And not all of S1 through S5 are true vertebrae. They're not just like hanging around there. Some of them are fused. And depending on if you've had spinal surgery before, maybe you have other vertebrae that are also fused. But anyway, so these are all the spinal segments. And you're going to have what the nerves that exit your spinal cord are called spinal nerves. And so you're going to have something like 30, 32, depending on who you are, sets of spinal nerves. And these nerves are just giant highways with information entering and exiting your spinal cord. And so you might have sympathetic nerves going through these giant spinal nerves. And you might have parasympathetic nerves, and you might have skeletal muscle, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the divisions. So when we say sympathetic is thoracolumbar, that is because it starts off at T1 and then goes up to L3. And so this is the region in which it will be exiting. Sorry, so thoracic through lumbar is where your parasympathetic nerves will be exiting. So also here, you'll also have skeletal muscle and other nerves entering and exiting, but this is the region where your sympathetic nerves exit. So in this textbook, you can see that's very clearly drawn out here. You have your nerves exiting from the T1 through L3 region. And so all of this stuff is going to be bilateral. So you're going to have some exiting this side and some exiting this side. And where do these go? So these go to a ganglia. So what is a ganglia? A ganglia is just a place where you have one nerve synapsing onto another nerve. Okay. So in the sympathetic nervous system, you're going to have two main ganglia. And this is known as the prevertebral and the paravertebral ganglia. Right? So it's going to be called your prevertebral and your paravertebral ganglia. And just to reiterate, ganglia is just the site at which you're going to have a preganglionic neuron go and synapse onto a postganglionic neuron. So let's say, for example, you have your spine here. Let's say you have your skull here and then your spinal column here. And you have a nerve. So this is your brain and this is your spine. You have a nerve that's leaving right here. And it's saying, hey, I need to go and do something to the liver or the heart. It's going to go and then it's going to synapse right here onto another nerve. And then that nerve is going to go to your heart. The site at which this happens is called the ganglia. And the nerve before it is going to be called the preganglionic neuron. And then this neuron is going to be called the postganglionic neuron. And the ganglia is where the cell bodies of all of these postganglionic neurons are housed. And so you're going to have a preganglionic neuron. So this, again, in your peripheral nervous system, right, exiting your central nervous system, you're going to have a neuron that's called a preganglionic neuron that's going to go and synapse onto a postganglionic neuron that then goes and affects at the effector site. Ganglia is at the place at which the synapse happens. Ganglia is just a collection of the postganglionic neuron cell bodies, right? So it's kind of important to note that sympathetic ganglia are going to be divided up into these two main categories, the prevertebral ganglia and the paravertebral ganglia. The reason being, these are giant chains of ganglia that are paravertebral, so next to your spinal cord on both sides, and prevertebral, anterior to your spinal column, where the preganglionic neurons are going to synapse onto postganglionic neurons. And how you'll see this in anatomy is they are literal chains. You can see these giant macroscopic chains that you can touch and feel and dissect, where the preganglionic neurons are synapsing onto the postganglionic neurons. And so how they've illustrated that in this textbook here is basically you have these paravertebral chains that are also going to be known as the sympathetic chains, sometimes known as the sympathetic chain gang or the sympathetic chain ganglia. So if you hear chain gang or something like that, this is what they're talking about. It's the sympathetic preganglionics synapsing onto the postganglionics. And all the sympathetics do this. And then from there, they will go and synapse onto their final effector site. And so you can see here, there is going to be a giant chain gang here. And then you're going to have nerves that go onto their effector sites. And usually the nerves, they exit their spinal cord around where they're going to go have their effect. And so you can see these nerves that are leaving at T1, they're going to go to the heart, right? That makes sense because your T1 starts around here. And then you have like your mid-Ts, maybe T4 going to your lungs, and then lower down going to your intestine, lowering down going into your even further lower intestine. Your adrenal medulla specifically, this exits at around T5 through T9. Maybe some of them, maybe all of them, depends on who you are. And then at the very bottom, you're going to have some exiting to your genitalia. So that's how the sympathetic division is. anatomically organized. And remember, this is called the thoracolumbar division. Just like that, the parasympathetic is called the craniosacral division. And the reason is because it is made up of cranial nerves and nerves that exit the sacral region of your spinal cord. And you can see that here. So looking first at the cranial nerves. So you have 12 cranial nerves total, and we'll go into that in a second. Of those 12 cranial nerves, a lot of them have afferent function going back towards your brain. So this can be sensory stuff. Efferent function going away from your brain. So this can be motor stuff, this can be autonomic stuff, you name it. Of these 12 cranial nerves, 4 of them, 3, 7, 9, and 10, and I should lead by example. Cranial nerves are usually shown by their Roman numerals. So 3, 7, 9, and 10. Of these 12, 3, 7, 9, and 10 have some parasympathetic function. And you can see that here. So 3 is going to go to your eye. 7 is going to go to your lacrimal and nasal gland. So lacrimal comes from, if you know Spanish, lagrima, right? Lagrima means tear. So lacrimal means your tear ducts. Your lacrimal and your nasal glands. Your submandibular, so mandible is your jaw, your submandibular, and your sublingual. Lingual means your tongue. So submandibular and sublingual glands. So these are going to be salivary glands. And then your parotid gland, which is another, well, parotid is from cranial nerve 9. And that's also a salivary gland. So 7 is going to go to these salivary glands. 9 is going to go to this salivary gland. 10 is the infamous vagus nerve. If I do N dot, that means nerve. You'll probably see that in anatomy as well. And then M dot means muscle. MM will mean muscles, et cetera, et cetera. And the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve, as I referred to before, this is going to go to all the way, like, it's going to do some stuff in your throat and like some motor stuff. Your larynx is primarily the motor function of your larynx is primarily provided by the vagus nerve. So the reason I'm able to talk for so long, I'm talking for like half an hour now, is because of my vagus nerve. Thank you, vagus nerve. Let's all thank our vagus nerves. Also, it's going to wander and it's going to go down to through your thorax to the rest of your body. And so this is going to be your heart, your bronchi, and in your lungs, your stomach, all the way down to the top of your large intestine. So this is cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. 10 is primarily doing all of this stuff down into your thorax because it's the wandering nerve. It's going to go, all the other cranial nerves usually stay in this region, in the cranial region. We said parasympathetic is the craniosacral division. It does the top and the bottom. And so from the sacral division, it goes through the pelvic splanchnic nerves, and it goes to the lower intestine, it goes to your bladder, and it goes to genitalia. All right. So a lot of these organs are going to be under sympathetic control and parasympathetic control, right? So both parasympathetic and sympathetic can have actions on it. Parasympathetic and sympathetic are usually divided up as parasympathetic being rest and digest, sympathetic being fight or flight. This is very crude. It does not always hold true. And I urge you to think about it in some different ways. I think that generally holds true, but I urge you to think about it anatomically. So what is sympathetic? Quiz yourself real quick. What is the anatomic division? Thoracolumbar, because it exits your spinal cord in the regions from T1 through L3, L2, L3. How about your parasympathetic? It's known as craniosacral because you have cranial nerves. What are the 4 cranial nerves? 3, 7, 9, and 10. We'll go through cranial nerves in a second. And your pelvic splanchnic nerves exiting from S2 through S4. It's going to be the craniosacral division. So this is the general division. And here you can see we've spoken about the anatomical division, so thoracolumbar here. And then parasympathetic is craniosacral. We also spoke about the ganglia, right? So we have sympathetic nerves that exit onto the paravertebral and prevertebral ganglia, which is where the preganglionic synapses onto the postganglionic. For the parasympathetic, you have some very specific ganglia, as you can see here. Ciliary ganglia, your pterygopalatine ganglia. So pterygopalatine, these are names of bones and regions of your skull. And so when you get into the MBB block, you'll learn about pterygo and palatine and what that means. Submandibular, right? Sub means under, mandibular means mandible. Otic, meaning going to the parotid, etc. And so the parasympathetic will have specific ganglia names. Where they exit from is also very important. You'll see that the cranial nerves primarily are numbered by where they exit from, whether in your brainstem. And so the first few are going to exit from your midbrain, then from your pons and your medulla. So this is your brainstem. These are the divisions of your brainstem. you're going to have midbrain, pons, and medulla. And these are the specific nuclei from which they arise. So from the midbrain, you're going to have cranial 3. You're also going to have some other cranial nerves. From your pons, you're going to have cranial nerve 7. You're going to have other cranial nerves as well. And then cranial nerves 9 and 10 are going to come from your medulla. So this is the general division of your sympathetic and parasympathetic. And just so you know, these images are coming from a textbook written by Dr. Costanzo. It's called Physiology. Highly recommend it. All of the information I'm presenting to you right now will also be presented in chapter 2 of Costanzo. Some of the information is presented a little differently, especially for things like GPCRs and things like that. I recommend you watch this video rather than you read the textbook. I think the textbook has made it fairly confusing. All the other stuff, I definitely suggest that you read it. So let's see what we've covered so far. So we've gone through, we said cells are dumb, etc. We said that nerves are just bundles of neurons. This can be information going in any direction. For divisions of the nervous system, we said we have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system is your brain, brainstem, and spinal cord, and all of the interneurons that are in there as well. Your peripheral nervous system are the nerves entering and exiting your central nervous system, and this is going into the periphery, so the rest of your body. And this can be stuff like skeletal muscle. This can be autonomics, etc. And this can be divided up into your afferent and efferent. So afferent is going towards the central nervous system. Efferent is going away. And specifically looking at, well, in both of them, you're going to have voluntary and involuntary. Specifically looking at going away in the efferents, we're going to have voluntary, which is going to be your somatic skeletal muscle controlling nerves. Involuntary is going to be your autonomic, controlling your parasympathetic, sympathetic functions. And so now when we go back to this diagram, you're going to notice that I made some of these neurons pretty long and some of them pretty short. The reason is because of the location of the ganglia. So remember where the ganglia are? The ganglia for the sympathetic, what are they called? Paravertebral and prevertebral. These are going to be very near the vertebral columns, which means they're going to be very near the spinal cord. If they're very near the spinal cord, the preganglionic neuron, the nerve that goes and synapses onto the ganglia, those are going to be tiny. So because of that, that's why I've drawn this first preganglionic as tiny, and then the postganglionic is much longer. So the preganglionic neuron is going to start in the central nervous system, is going to exit from the spinal cord, and then it's immediately going to synapse at the ganglia to the postganglionic. That postganglionic is going to be super long, and that postganglionic neuron is going to go all the way from from next to the vertebra, all the way to the effector site. And so that could be anywhere in the body. Parasympathetics, on the other hand, they have their ganglia very far from where they exit. So let's say you have your cranial nerve, for example, a cranial nerve 3 that's exiting out of your brainstem. After it exits from the midbrain, it's going to go all the way to the eyeball, and there it's going to have a ganglia. So it's first going to have the really long segment, and then it's going to have a ganglia, the ciliary ganglia, and then it's going to have a tiny short postganglionic neuron that goes and does the effector. So that's why I've divided it up like this. And we spoke very briefly about the adrenal medulla. We said this exits the spinal cord at about T5 through T9. We can fill in some gaps here. So this is called the craniosacral division. This is called the thoracolumbar division. So this is going to be which cranial nerves and which sacral division? Do you remember? Also, I should have said this earlier. Don't worry too much about taking notes. I'll make my notes available so that you can review them. I think what's more important is making that metacognition in your brain right now. Being aware that cranial nerves exist. Being aware that there's a sympathetic and parasympathetic. So it's going to be 3, 7, 9, and 10. And then your sacral S2 through S4. Then thoracolumbar means about T1 through L3. All right. So we've covered a lot. Hopefully you're still on board. Now we're going to go through, well, what do we have next? We've gone through parasympathetic and sympathetic. We kind of know what they do. This is all autonomic function. And we've gone through somatic. And so the preganglionic and postganglionic for somatic. This is not going to be called preganglionic, postganglionic. They're going to be called upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. And so when you get to MBB, you might learn that there's a thing called an upper motor neuron syndrome. That means that some of these nerves are damaged. And then you're going to have a lower motor neuron syndrome. It means some of these nerves are damaged. And your lower motor neurons can also be divided up. You're going to have some alpha neurons, which are going to be skeletal muscle, beta neurons, gamma neurons. But again, we're not going to worry too much about that. All right, so this is going to be called upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. These are going to be called preganglionic and postganglionic. All right. So let's take a break right there. As you can see, we've covered a lot of stuff already, and think about all the stuff we've covered and try and quiz yourself a little bit, and we will jump back in with the cranial nerves. All right. All right. So hopefully you are well rested and ready to move on. So we've spoken about sympathetic and parasympathetic. We know that these are general divisions of the efferent autonomic nervous system. Let's talk a little bit more about cranial nerves in particular. Again, the reason I want to bring this up is so that when you hear cranial nerve throughout the rest of medical school, until you learn it in MBB, you're not going to be like, oh, what is a cranial nerve? I don't really know what that is. So we spoke about the parasympathetic nervous system. So really quick, sympathetic nervous system is the anatomic, what's the anatomical division for it? Thoracolumbar. Exits from T1 through L3. Parasympathetic is going to be craniosacral. Which cranial nerves have parasympathetic function? 3, 7, 9, and 10. But you actually have 12 cranial nerves, as I suggested earlier. So what are all these cranial nerves, and what does cranial nerve really mean? So cranial nerves were named cranial nerves, which will sometimes be shortened to CN. Cranial nerves were named because when they were initially found, upon dissection, they all looked like they exited from the brain. And this is not totally true, and we'll go through the exception in a second, but there are 12 cranial nerves, and they're all identified by their Roman numerals, all right? And so let's make, and again, since it's a nerve, it can have bidirectional information, it can have sensory information going up, it can have motor information going down, don't forget that. So you're gonna have 12 cranial nerves, all right? And let's take a look at face. So let's say this is your face, right? This is what your skull looks like, right? Hopefully that's a pretty good representation. And you have 12 cranial nerves, and we know that 4 of them have some parasympathetic function. But let's go through all 12 of them very briefly so that when you hear these cranial nerves later, you are familiar with them. So I'm just going to write them out real quick. 3, 4, 5. You probably did not watch this video just to test me on my Roman numerals. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Whew. All right. So we have 12 cranial nerves. What are they going to do? So let's think about the functions that need to be done in this region. So we already said that 10 is the vagus nerve, and that's the wandering thing, and that's going to do a whole lot of things, right? So let's just cross that guy out real quick, right? So 10 is the vagus nerve. Does a lot of things. Vagus nerve. All right, well, we only have 11 left. What are the other things that we need to do in this area? So we need to be able to see, right? That's important. We need to be able to smell. We need to be able to hear. We need to be able to taste. We need to be able to feel our face. We need to be able to move our face. So many things that we have to do. So let's go through these specific sensory ones first. So cranial nerve 1 is going to be your smelling nerve. It's not called the smelling nerve. Olfactory nerve, and it's going to be providing your smell information. Cranial nerve 2 is going to be your optic nerve, and it's going to be providing the visual information. If you've seen like pictures of the back of the retina, you'll see that little dark spot of your optic nerve. That is where the sensory information, that is when light hits your retina and you have your rods and cones go berserk, the information is going to go down your optic nerve into your brain. Cranial nerve 3 is your oculomotor nerve. So 3, 4, and 6, not 11, 6, all have to do with primarily movement of the eye. So 4 is your trochlear nerve, and 6 is your abducens nerve. So we said olfactory smell, optic is vision. These 3 are all going to have to do with eye movement. 3, 4, and 6 are all eye movement. All right, let's get rid of those. 3, 4, 6. And we also said that the oculomotor nerve has some parasympathetic function, right? So don't forget that. Parasympathetic function was going to your ciliary ganglia and then doing stuff in your eyes, such as with your pupillary constrictor muscle. But for right now, know that 3, 4, and 6 all do eye movement. 3 does the most of it, and then 4 does one eye muscle, 6 does one eye muscle. All right, so we finished off the eye, we finished off the nose. We have to be able to feel our face. So feeling our face is going to be your trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve 5. And so cranial nerve 5 gets a little bit confusing because there are 3 branches. All of these nerves are going to have branches. But the reason it was confusing for me is because these branches, which are, this is the trigeminal nerve, trigeminal. As you can see, tri meaning 3, geminal meaning originating from. So trigeminal nerve has 3 branches, but they're called V1, V2, and V3. They're not called 5, 1, 5, 2, 5, 3. So this is going to be called V1, right? Or that's how it's pronounced. And so these 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve are going to give sensation to 3 regions of the face. And so V1 is primarily going to give sensation to this region. V2 is going to give sensation to this middle region, and then V3 is going to give sensation. That was a totally bad drawing. Let me try that again. So V1 is going to give sensation to this region. V2 is going to give sensation to this region. And V3 is going to give sensation to the rest of it. So if you get slapped like right here, trigeminal nerve branch V2 is going to send that information to your brain. Right? If you get slapped down here, V3 is going to send that. If you get slapped up here, if you're slapping yourself because you didn't realize what the trigeminal nerve does, that's going to be V1 that's sending information to your brain. And these guys have names also. This is the ophthalmic nerve. This is the maxillary, coming from maxilla, which is this bone, maxillary nerve, and your mandibular nerve. So this is going to provide that sensation from your face. So V1, V2, and V3. The mandibular nerve additionally also does your muscles of mastication, as well as some other muscles. But remember that the mandibular nerve, the jaw nerve, does your chewing muscles, right? And so we can move that bottom part of our face now, and we have sensation to our face. But we need to be able to move the rest of our face too, right? So that's going to be cranial nerve 7, which is appropriately called the facial nerve, because it lets you do most of your muscles of facial expression. And so anything that you can think of that you do with facial expression, most of that is done by your facial nerve. All right. Facial nerve is also going to do a large part of your taste. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, taste. Okay, so the sensation from the tongue is going to be split up into 2 things. It's going to be taste, and sensation. And so there are different nerves that do each of these. I'm not going to get into it right now, but some of them are going to do 1/3 of this and 2/3 of this. Some of them are going to do 2/3 of this and 1/3 of this. But keep those things separate, taste and somatic sensation. All right, so the taste from the anterior 2/3 of your tongue, that's done by a branch or a little bit of your facial nerve. It's going to come from the chorda tympani. But anyway, so, oh my God, we're almost done. So 5, we finished that. That is your trigeminal nerve sensation, doom, 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 and your jaw muscles. 7, we also finished. We need to be able to hear. That's 8. So 8 is your vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear. And so vestibule and cochlea. So this is going to provide hearing and balance. We finished 8. All right, 9, 11, and 12. These are pretty straightforward. 9 and 12 are both going to, so this is your glossopharyngeal. So glossus means tongue, just like lingual, glossal and lingual. Pharyngeal, pharynx, throat. And your hypoglossal. So hypoglossal, 12 is going to be your motor innervation to your tongue. It's going to let you move your tongue around. And then your glossopharyngeal, tongue muscles. Your glossopharyngeal is going to do a whole bunch of things. It's going to have some sensory stuff. It's going to have some motor stuff. But know that it goes to the glossopharyngeal region, right? Your tongue and your throat. All right. And then last one is 11. And this is your accessory nerve. And whenever someone asks, what does your accessory nerve do? You're going to say, I don't know. You're going to shrug and you're going to shake your head. I don't know. The reason is because that's exactly what it does. Accessory nerve. It does two muscles. One is your sternocleidomastoid, and one is your trapezius. So your trapezius or your traps, that's what lets you shrug your shoulders. And you can test this real quick by putting pressure down on one of your shoulders and lifting up. You'll feel this muscle right here pop out. That's your trapezius muscle. Then your sternocleidomastoid, sternocleidomastoid. There's no space there. Sternocleidomastoid goes from your sternum and your clavicle to your mastoid process. So your mastoid process is this guy right here behind your ear. I don't know if you can really see that, but that is where this muscle attaches. All right. So you can test this by putting pressure against that side of your head, and you see that muscle popping out right there. Tiny muscle that I hardly have. That's your sternocleidomastoid. It's this big muscle, and it lets you rotate your head in both directions. You have one on each side. All of this stuff is bilateral, right? All these cranial nerves as well. And so when someone says, what does your accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11 do? You're going to say, I don't know, because your traps are going to help lift your shoulders, and then your sternocleidomastoid lets you shake your head. And that's all your cranial nerves. Hopefully that was pretty straightforward. So you have cranial nerve 1 is smell. Cranial nerve 2 is sight. 3 through 6 are going to let your eyes move around. 5 is going to give you your trigeminal nerve sensation to your face and your chewing from your mandibular. 7 is going to give you motion of your face, so moving your face around. It's also going to give you a little bit of taste. 11, I don't know. 9 and 10 are going to go to your tongue. So, 9 and 12. 12 is going to go to your tongue, and 9 is going to go a little bit to your tongue. It's also going to go and do a few other things. That's it. Those are your cranial nerves. And again, don't worry about memorizing this, but the reason I'm bringing this up, this looks like a Dia de los Muertos kind of thing. The reason I'm bringing this up is just because next time you hear cranial nerve and they say, oh, cranial nerve, this does this as well, you're not going to be like, oh, what is a cranial nerve? Remember, which are the cranial nerves that have parasympathetic function as well? 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay? They're all going to have parasympathetic function as well. All right. So we've gotten through cranial nerves. Wow, we're blowing through this. Cranial nerves. Spinal cord tracts. All right. This is something you may have learned in undergraduate physiology. So really quickly, recapping. Oh, I don't know if you guys can still see what I'm writing. Okay, it's a little bit delayed. Is it still delayed? Oh yeah, it is. Here, let me stop my screen recording real quick, and I will start it up again, and hopefully it'll be less delayed then. All right, so spinal cord tracts. So spinal cord tracts are the way that information gets to and from our brain, right? So we have brain, brainstem, and spinal cord in the central nervous system, and information leaving our brain, brainstem, going down our spinal cord are going to go through tracts. So tracts are specific regions within our spinal cord in which information is either ascending or descending. So let's take a look at these. And from our spinal cord in our spinal cord tracts, we're going to have some tracts that primarily do autonomic information, some tracts that do motor information, etc. And so we're going to go through the major divisions of this. And if this is not review for you, hopefully it makes sense. So the reason I'm bringing up spinal cord tracts now is because we know where the information either is coming from or needs to go. The afferent information is going towards our central nervous system, and the efferent information is going away. So the afferent information, this is going to be sensory stuff coming from our periphery, and it's going to be, tingling up our arm and then going towards our spinal cord. But then it needs to ascend within our spinal cord to get to our brain and say that, hey, you have this tingly sensation in your right arm or left arm. And then when we have information that goes back out, it starts in our brain and then it goes down our spinal cord again and then goes out into the periphery. So where is it going up and down within the spinal cord? That's what we're gonna explore right now. So really quickly, let's look at what a vertebrae looks like. So this is what a classic vertebrae looks like. It's going to have a hole right here, and our spinal cord is going to be going through it. So this is kind of a top-down view where this is anterior and this is posterior. Or also, this could be known as dorsal and ventral. The reason it's called dorsal and ventral is because dorsal is kind of like the dorsal fin of a shark. And so when we're referring to animals and humans that are like hunched over, it's much better to say dorsal and ventral. So dorsal towards the back, ventral towards the front, as opposed to anterior and posterior. But anterior and posterior, now that we're standing up, we can say anterior and posterior. So dorsal and ventral, a little bit antiquated, but you'll still see them used. Maybe I'm speaking too quickly. If I am, please slow down the video. So we're going to have our spinal cord that's going through here. And our spinal cord is essentially a long rope that, it's delayed again. Our spinal cord is a long rope that has these vertebrae hanging off of it like a bunch of beads, essentially. And so you're going to have another vertebrae right here. It's going to look like this, right? And they're all going to be lined up. That's a weird vertebrae. And then this is the giant chunky region, the vertebral body, that's providing a lot of structure to your spine, essentially. And then these are the spinous processes coming off of the vertebral body, where muscles attach. And these are a lot of your back core muscles that let you do like rotating things that provide your posture, etc. It's kind of a general rule of thumb. Whenever you have a bone that has a process or some sort of bony process protruding from it, that's usually where a muscle is attaching, or a tendon or ligament or something like that. The reason is kind of because anatomically, if you imagine you're pulling on this muscle, you're pulling on this bone with this muscle over and over and over again, it's kind of going to pull that bone out alone. That bone is going to adapt to it. As a general little tidbit of information, your cells, as they are trying to maintain homeostasis, they will always try and adapt to the stresses placed upon them. And so sometimes these stresses can be too much and then the cells will go crazy, but sometimes these stresses will allow for change to happen as an adaptation. So one example is Barrett's esophagus. This is kind of a total sidetrack, but Barrett's esophagus. And that's basically when you have a lot of acid reflux over a long period of time, and that acid is essentially going into your throat where it shouldn't be, and instead of being in your stomach. And when it keeps going and hitting your throat, you're going to get Barrett's esophagus, which is basically where the epithelium of your esophagus starts turning into non-esophageal epithelium. It'll start become mucus producing, and it'll change its morphology completely. And so it has a giant stress on it, and now it's changing because of that stress. So going back to the whole concept of bones, you have these processes coming off your spine because this is where you have muscles pulling off of. And also as an evolutionary adaptation over time, you're going to have these processes that are a little stronger and allowing for muscular torsion on the bone. So even on your knee, for example, you're going to have a tubercle coming off of your tibia. That's where your patellar tendon attaches. It's going to allow for you to extend your knee. All right, so we know where that was a long tangent. We know where the nerve, the giant nerve called your spinal cord, we know where this huge bundle of nerves called your spinal cord goes through, right? Straight down your back. And so let's say we have, let's say this is your skull again, and then your vertebrae, and you're going to have a brain, and you're going to have spinal cord going down through it. So let's take a cross section. Okay, and so now we're looking like top-down view, and we have a spinal vertebrae, and your spinal cord is going to be in there. And so let's zoom in on this guy a little more. And so within that hole, within that spinal cord, you're going to have a couple different regions. You're going to have a region of gray matter in here, and then you're going to have a region of white matter out here. And remember that Gray matter is unmyelinated, which means it doesn't have that conducting sheath on it. And then white matter is myelinated, and it will have that conducting sheath on it. And the reason we have gray matter and white matter areas of the spinal cord is because this is where the nerves are primarily conducting the information versus they are entering or exiting the spinal cord. And so remember that this pattern is going to happen throughout the entire spinal cord, right? So it's going to go all the way down here, and it's going to go all the way up to the brainstem. And this is because you're going to have nerves that are going up and down through these areas, and then they're going to be exiting and entering in these areas. So you're going to have nerves that are going up and down, up and down, up and down, maybe through here, you know, going down, coming back up, etc. And the gray matter is where they are exiting. Okay, so let's say we take a section at T6. Remember I said that T5 through T9 is where the sympathetics exit to go to the adrenal medulla. And so let's say this is where the sympathetics are descending. And let's say right here is, let's say this is T6, and let's say this is C4 or something like that. Here, the sympathetics are just going to keep going, and they're just going to be like, I don't have to leave yet. It's just a highway. And it's now, when it gets to T6, it's like, all right, it's time to leave. And so then it will exit. All right. But at C4, you're also going to have some nerves that are exiting, maybe the nerves that need to go to your neck or to your arm or something like that. And so those nerves, they've been descending this whole time. So you have some motor nerves that are descending this whole time. But then when they get to C4, they're like, all right, time to go. And they exit. Right? So at every segment, you're going to have some people exiting. You're going to have some people entering. And you're going to have some people that continue up and down at every level, all the way down to the very bottom. All right. So the spinal cord tracts are the regions of the white matter. So the gray matter is where we're going to have entrance and exit. The spinal cord tracts are the region of white matter where we're going to have certain information going up and down. And the tracts essentially are pretty well characterized in terms of what information they are transmitting. And we can divide this up into roughly 4 main tracts, all right? And these 4 tracts are going to be our motor information. So we're going to have, motor information. We're going to have 2 sensory tracts. And then we're going to have 1 tract of our autonomics. And this is not as well studied, pretty well characterized, not as well studied, autonomic. But I'm going to go through them anyway, just so you get an idea, just so you know that there's some place in which this information is kind of going up and kind of coming down and exiting and entering, etc. So the motor information, this is going through your corticospinal tract, Your sensory information, this is going to go through your spinothalamic tract and your DCML, which I will expand later. And your autonomics are going to go through your autonomic tracts. So of your corticospinal tract, so these also have other names. I'll write them here just so you know. This is sometimes called your pyramidal tract. This is sometimes called your anterolateral tract. This is sometimes called your posterior tract. And that gives you a little better idea of where they are anatomically. And so, okay, so this is going to be dorsal, and this is ventral. Remember, this basically for humans means anterior and posterior, at least through your spine. So your pyramidal tracts are primarily going to be right here. This is going to be your lateral corticospinal tract. And then you're going to have a medial corticospinal tract. And remember that these are all bilateral. So you're also going to have one right here and one right here. And remember, don't worry about taking notes or drawing this out. I'll make my notes available to you. So this is going to be your lateral corticospinal and your medial corticospinal tracts. And this is going to provide all of your skeletal muscle movement. And your lateral tracts are primarily going to provide information for your limbs. And your medial corticospinal tract are going to provide information for your core muscles, your trunk muscles. okay? So next, we're going to have the spinothalamic, and this is going to be sensory, all right? And you're going to have a lateral and anterior in this case. Your lateral tract is going to be right here. And remember, when I say tract, it means this is where the information is going up and down. When it exits, it's always going to, go all the way down within this tract and then exit something like this. And you're going to have, so this is this is called the anterior tract, the lateral tract, and then you're going to have an anterior tract. And there's more tracts than this. These are the main ones. Your anterior tracts are going to provide your crude touch. So that's crude touch. And then your lateral tracts are going to provide your pain and temperature. Your DCML, so this means dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. That's going to be right here. And this is going to provide all of your useless sensory stuff. And so this is things like hair sense, vibration, proprioception, things like that. And the way I like to think about this is, remember, this is dorsal. This is towards your back. Humans are kind of anterior beings, right? We're able to protect our front. And so if we get attacked from a bear from behind, the first thing that's going to go is our DCML stuff. Thankfully, that's all pretty much useless because we can live without having vibration and proprioception and things like that. We can't really live without pain and without having pain and temperature and stuff like that. Like, let's say we put our hand into the fire we just made because we're caveman. We want to know that it hurts, ow, so that we can like get away from it and make sure we never do that again. For sensory stuff, if that stuff goes, the like hair sense and proprioception, vibration, if that stuff goes, it's fine. So maybe this is actually how it went evolutionarily, but this is just how I like to think about it. Your useless stuff is back here. More important stuff is towards the front, less likely to get affected, because remember, this is where you're going to have your giant vertebral body, and then you're going to have like the rest of your anterior organs here, right? So coming back to this, all right, and then our sympathetic, parasympathetic, our autonomics, they're going to be in this, it's kind of be through your, it's called the dorsomedial lateral funiculus, so it's lateral to your intromedial lateral cell column. So it's going to be like right here and right here. Again, less well studied. So let's go through each of these in a little bit more detail. Okay. So starting off with number one, this was our motor, which is also known as the cortico spinal or pyramidal tract. And we said that the information passes through a lateral tract right here and a medial tract right here. And all of these tracts are going to have a decussation. And decussation means a crossing over. And this comes from dec, deca, meaning 10, like decathlon. And the Roman numeral for that is 10, right? Which is a cross. And so decussation is where things cross over. Okay, so all of these are going to have, they're either going to be ascending or descending. They're going to be, because of that, they're going to be providing a certain sort of information, and they're going to have a decussation. So our tracts over here, they're also going to have a certain number of nerves. So our tracts, our motor tracts, the lateral tracts are going to decussate up here in the medulla, and then they're going to go down and exit towards wherever they need to go. And so they're going to go down, they're going to decussate in the medulla. The lateral tracts are going to decussate in the medulla. Remember, this is limb information. Here, they're going to synapse onto another nerve, and then they're going to go where they need to go. The medial tracts are going to go all the way down to the segment. So let's say it's doing your butt muscles or something like that. And so it's going down to your L1, L2. Then it's going to decussate, and then it's going to synapse and then go to wherever it needs to go. So remember, this is your limbs, and this is your trunk. So your limb information is going to decussate up here in the medulla. Your trunk information is going to decussate down here. So why is this relevant? Let's say that you damage half of your spinal cord right there. At any given level, this guy right here already decussated. So you're going to get that information to the opposite side. This has not yet given its information to the opposite side. So you're going to lose some trunk information to the opposite side. And so sometimes people say like, oh, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. And that is true in terms of this decussation, where you have certain information that starts off on a certain side and then goes to a certain side, or vice versa. And so if you see a person who does not have trunk movement to a certain side, but they do have limb movement, it could mean that the lesion is on the side after this first decussation. So it could be maybe in your cervical region, or maybe in your thoracic region before it got down to the lumbar. So all of these nerves are shot, but these nerves are doing just fine on the other side. All right, let's look at our next tracts. So now we're going to look at some sensory tracts. So we're going to have our spinothalamic, which is also known as anterolateral. And this, we're going to have a lateral and an anterior tract. So lateral tract is going to be right here. Anterior tract is going to be over here. So our anterior tract is going to be crude touch, and our lateral tract is going to be pain and temperature. And so this is sensory information, so it's ascending, right? So let's draw another one over here. Remember, they're all bilateral. And this information is going to decussate in the segment. And so the information is going to come through here. We're going to get a synapse onto a second nerve, and then that nerve is going to bring that information up all the way to the brain. And then you're going to have a third nerve that synapses in the thalamus, less important. The other sensory information is going to be through our dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, right? Just over here. And again, this is going to, this one is not going to decussate in the segment. This one's going to decussate in the dorsal column nucleus. So that's going to be up in your brain. So don't really worry about that too much, but it's basically going to come up through here. It's going to go into your brain and then decussate, or into your brainstem and then decussate there. All right. And then finally, the autonomic tract. We mentioned that already. Descending through. All right. So that's basically your spinal columns, the main spinal columns that you need to know. Again, don't worry about taking notes. I'll make my notes available. I guess I just repeated myself twice. Hopefully that helped, so that you know where the decussations are and that sort of thing. All right, so taking a look real quick at our table of contents, we went through our cranial nerves. We went through our spinal cord tracts. Only thing we have left is our receptors and GPCRs and organ systems. So really quick recap. We went through the introduction, we talked about nerves and neurons, we talked about divisions of nervous system, the nervous system afferent and efferent. Of both of those, we have somatic, voluntary, autonomic, involuntary, sympathetic and parasympathetic as divisions of the efferent, autonomic, involuntary system. And we spoke a little bit about the ganglia, we spoke a little bit about the anatomy. Sympathetic is thoracolumbar, parasympathetic is craniosacral. We went through the cranial nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves. And their general functions. How do we make facial expressions? Facial nerve 7. Sorry, cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. And then how do we chew? V3, third branch of the trigeminal nerve. And then sensation is also trigeminal nerve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then we went through the spinal cord tracts. So take a break right here. And when we get back, we will talk about receptors and GPCRs. Those are very important. All right, so hopefully that break was restful for you. And let's move on to kind of the final section. So we've spoken about where the information is coming from and where the information is going through, going through, how that information gets there, etc. And it's important to know that, so we have our efferent information, afferent information. We have the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. We have sympathetic and parasympathetic, all of these different divisions. I'm probably speaking really fast and saying all of these things. Again, this is just to get those words floating around in your brain. So when you learn it, it'll become super easy. It's also important to know how exactly what is the biochemical basis for this, and how exactly are we sending those signals? How exactly are we making certain organs do certain things? And that is when this concept of receptors and stuff come in. So we spoke a little bit about the neurotransmitters. We said that we have some acetylcholine and we have some epinephrine and norepinephrine, but how do they go and actually affect things? And this is going to be the site of pharmacological intervention as well. So it's pretty important to know what's going on here in terms of what the receptors are and what are GPCRs, all right? So you probably know about GPCRs from the first block, but let's go back to our diagram right here. And really quickly, we said that we have acetylcholine at a lot of these junctions, and then we have adrenaline too. And so some of these are going to be synapsing onto like some smooth muscles. So let's say this nerve goes and puts some acetylcholine on a smooth muscle or a gland. This one goes and puts some on a sweat gland. And this one is going to another smooth muscle, right? So SM is a smooth muscle, by the way. So it's going to go and put norepinephrine on that gland, or it's going to put acetylcholine on that smooth muscle. So what exactly happens there? So this is where the concept of receptors come back. So remember, cells are dumb. They're not going to do anything on their own volition. However, if there is a receptor there that gets a signal, that's going to send a signal into the cell and tell the cell to do something. So let's talk about these really quickly. So let's hope it's really quick. So receptors. So the most important receptor for autonomic nervous system is going to be GPCRs, right? And so these are GPCRs. This is also known as G protein coupled. G protein coupled. I don't know where that hyphen is supposed to be. Receptor. So receptor just means a guy that's hanging around on the cell membrane that makes the outside world able to communicate with the inside world. G protein comes from the actual protein that is inside the cell membrane that is hanging out right next to the receptor there that allows for this receptor action to happen, which is why it's called G protein coupled. So G comes from guanine, which is irrelevant. This is also called the 7-transmembrane receptor. And the reason is because when you have a cell membrane like this, it's going to have 7 transmembrane domains, aka it's going to cross through the membrane. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's going to cross through the cell membrane 7 times. And again, it's a GPCR. All you need to know is that it's a receptor. So you're going to have a signal that's coming around and goes and attaches on here, and then this receptor will tell the inside to do something. All right. And the GPCRs of the autonomic nervous system can be divided up into 2 main categories. And this is based on the neurotransmitter used. And so this can be adrenergic. Let's make that pink like we made it pink earlier. Adrenergic and cholinergic. All right. And so adrenergic, meaning it's going to respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Cholinergic means it's going to respond to primarily acetylcholine. And then this is where they get divided up into the specific receptors that you'll hear of, okay? And so you're going to have 4 main adrenergic receptors, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2. And of your cholinergic receptors, we can divide this up into 2 further categories. You're going to have some muscarinic, and you're going to have some nicotinic. And so you're going to have an M1, an M2, and I'm putting it in this order for a reason. M2, M3, M1, and you're going to have an N1 and an N2. And yeah. So now at least I've put these words in your head so that when you hear alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, you're going to remember, okay, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, adrenergic. So they're going to respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. So when I say they're going to respond to, let's say we're looking at your heart, for example, okay? And so this is your heart. And let's say there's a nerve. Let's say there's, what's going to be sympathetic or parasympathetic if it's adrenergic? It's going to be sympathetic, right? The parasympathetics don't use adrenaline. They don't use epinephrine nor epinephrine. So let's say you have your heart here. And you have on your heart, you have a beta 1 receptor. So it's a GPCR, which is kind of irrelevant, but it's a beta 1 receptor. So what's going to happen? When you have epinephrine or norepinephrine that's floating around, comes around, let's say we have norepinephrine that's floating around, and let's say we have epinephrine floating around, and let's say these go and attach onto this receptor. What's going to happen is it's going to tell the heart cell to do something. And if all the heart cells do something, maybe the heart contracts faster, or maybe you get stronger contractions or something like that. Right. So that's essentially what's going to happen when you have a receptor that is acted upon by one of these neurotransmitters. So the other important thing to know, I said it was irrelevant, but I'm going to come back to it now, is what kind of GPCR each of these are. So let's draw these lines. So these are all the receptors you need to know in terms of the autonomic nervous system. The GPCRs, let's look at GPCRs really quick. So GPCRs can be split up into 4 categories, 3 main ones that I'll touch upon: GS, GI, and GQ. And these are just different classifications. They're based on what kind of G protein that you have in there. But again, they're just types of receptors. Okay, 3 types of GPCRs: GS, GI, and GQ. How these work are slightly different. So let's say you have a neurotransmitter like adrenaline or norepinephrine or acetylcholine, something floating around, and it binds to this GPCR. So you're going to get the signal binding. And then your G protein is going to get activated, right? So activate your G protein. Activate G protein. GS and GI, they work through a couple of different mediators. And just so that they're floating around in your head, one of them is called adenylyl cyclase, which will give you cyclic AMP. And then you're going to have PKA. For GQ, it's going to be PLC, PIP2, IP3, DAG, and PKC. All right. This is honestly probably more information than you need. Let me see if I can actually find the diagram for this. Yes. Okay. Right here. So this is kind of, so GS and GI work through this kind of pathway. So you have the GPCR, you have adenylyl cyclase that's hanging out in the membrane. This is going to allow for ATP to be converted into cyclic AMP, as you can see in the middle. The cyclic AMP activates PKA, protein kinase A, which then goes and does its phosphorylation. All right. So going back to this, basically what happens is for this whole pathway of adenylyl cyclase, cyclic AMP, and PKA, the final thing is you're going to get some phosphorylation and some intracellular action. Now, GS, what it does is it's going to, so GS and GI are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. GS is going to increase, so when you have, let's say you have acetylcholine, or let's say you have, adrenaline or norepinephrine that goes and attaches onto a GS receptor. When you have that norepinephrine attached to the GS receptor, it's going to hype up all of this stuff and increase your phosphorylation and increase your intracellular action. GI, on the other hand, let's say you have adrenaline or norepinephrine going and acting upon a GI receptor, it's actually going to decrease all of these things. So depending on the receptor, you're going to get a different action, even if it's the same neurotransmitter. Even if you have acetylcholine, for example, going to a GI, or let's say you have a noradrenaline, norepinephrine going to a GI receptor on an organ, it's going to decrease the function. If it goes and attaches onto the GS receptor, maybe on that same organ, maybe on a different part of that organ or something, it's going to increase the activation. So that's why the receptors are important, right? So looking at the GQ, this is how GQ works. So you're going to have your G protein get activated. Let's say you have norepinephrine hanging out and attaches onto the GQ receptor, or let's say you have acetylcholine goes and attaches onto the GQ receptor. What's going to happen is PLC, phospholipase C, phospholipase. So lipase means lipid means lipid. ACE means enzyme. So it's going to break apart membrane phospholipid. It's going to break the membrane phospholipid, which is PIP2, into IP3 and DAG. Now, DAG goes to protein kinase C, gets you your phosphorylated thing. IP3 is going to release calcium, and then you're going to get an intracellular response. Okay, so this is how GQ works. And that's why I have all of these guys here. And this is going to be an activating pathway. So you have a G protein, the GQ protein being activated. If you have a receptor that is of the GQ subtype, you're going to have increased activation through all of these mediators. All right? Woo! to intracellular activation. Okay, so that's kind of how your GPCRs work, and each of these cell types is going to be each of these cell receptor types is going to be a specific type of GPCR, which is why I brought those up. So this also has to do with how I've written them out. So this is going to be a GQ, GI, GS, GS, GI, GQ. This is also GQ. Okay, so you can see it's Q, I, S, S, I, Q, Q. So whenever I need to answer a question about this, I write it out like alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, M2, M3, M1. And then I write out QIS, SIQ. And that helps me remember. Right? So which kind of G protein it is will actually help us identify what the action of it is. So we know that GQ is going to be usually a activating thing, and GI is more inhibitory. GS is a little more stimulating. That's not necessarily going to hold true here, but it is going to talk about, it's more important to know what exactly the GPCRs are doing based on the biochemical pathway that I referred to earlier. Each of these, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, M2, M3, M1, are going to be on specific organs, which is what's going to tell us how those organs are going to respond to certain neurotransmitters. And just to briefly mention, GQ is usually going to be contraction. So this is how I abbreviate contraction of a smooth muscle. This can be in your vasculature, this can be in your GI, your bladder, etc. But it's going to be contraction of smooth muscle. For alpha 1 receptors, sorry, let me make that clear. Alpha 1 receptors are of the GQ GPCR subtype. Alpha 1 receptors, when acted upon by a neurotransmitter, are going to allow for contraction of smooth muscle. Right? Beta 1 primarily goes and acts upon the heart. All right? And so this is going to be increasing your heart rate, increasing contractility, increasing your conduction velocity, et cetera, et cetera. It's also going to have some other functions. Main one is on the heart. Beta 2 is going to be smooth muscle relaxation. So it's going to be relax smooth muscle. Again, this can be in your vasculature, so your blood vessels, this can be in your GI tract, this can be in your bladder, et cetera, et cetera. GI, the M2 GI is also going to be on your heart, but this is going to be inhibitory. So this is going to be excitatory, and it's going to be inhibitory. M3 is going to be contract, smooth muscle. And then M1 is, I mean, I've actually never seen M1 asked of me or anywhere anatomically, but this is in neural tissue and this is secondary. The alpha 2 GI receptors, these are autoreceptors, which means that when we have a nerve that goes on and there's another nerve here and it's trying to signal onto it, you're going to have some neurotransmitter that's released, and we're going to go and act upon the second nerve, right? So that this signal gets transmitted to this neuron. Autoreceptors are when this neurotransmitter goes and attaches on a receptor on that same neuron itself. So maybe there's a receptor right here. And so that neurotransmitter goes and it comes back and it's like, hey, stop releasing neurotransmitter or something like that. And so your alpha 2 is primarily going to be things like that. It's going to be autoreceptors. All right, autoreceptors or heteroreceptors. So when you have, let's say you have two neurons that are going to this synapse, right? A heteroreceptor is when this guy has a receptor and this neurotransmitter comes and talks to that one. All right, so this is going to be auto and hetero receptors. All right, wow, that's a lot of information, and we're going to synthesize that really quickly. The N1 and N2, also very important. This is also known as NM, and this is also known as NN. So you might see those as well. And these are all ligand-gated ion channels. And NM means nicotinic muscular, and NN means nicotinic neural. And as you can imagine, this is when we say nicotinic muscular. These are all your NMJs, and these are all your non-NEJ synapses. So this is going to be synapses between neurons, okay? Because at NEJs, the neuroeffector junctions, you're going to have all of these guys, right? And then, yeah, so this is going to be your non-NEJ synapses. So let's go back to our diagram real quick, and let's see how this plays out. So we have our little master diagram over here. So I said that the NN receptors are at all of your, or your N2, are at all of your synapses, essentially, right? So the receptor on the postganglionic neuron here, and here, and here, is all going to be N2. So the acetylcholine is going to leave the preganglionic neuron. It's going to attach onto an N2 receptor, which is a nicotinic neural receptor, on the postganglionic neuron, which is then going to go let it do the action of the next neuron. At the final site, we're going to have, here we're going to have some M2s. So acetylcholine is going to go to M2 and M3. M2 and M3. Here it's primarily going to be M3. And then this one is going to be all of your alphas and your betas. All right, so now our diagram is pretty much complete. All right, so we know what a preganglionic neuron is. We know what these neurotransmitters are. We know what the receptor is going to be where they attach onto and tell the second postganglionic neuron to do something. We know what those postganglionic neurons are going to release. And then we know how those postganglionic neurons are going to, let's say this guy acts upon a sweat gland, right? We know that the acetylcholine is going to go onto the M3 receptor, which is what? GQ, GI, GS, GS, GI, GQ, right? So M2 is going to be GI. M3 is going to be GQ. And so this is going to be a smooth muscle contraction of a sweat gland, right? So when you have a sympathetic innervation to a sweat gland and you're doing your fight or flight thing, when it goes to a sweat gland, it's going to contract the sweat gland. And this is going to allow for your glandular secretions and sweating, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So let's review this real quick. So remember, these are all the receptors for your sympathetic nervous system, or sympathetic and parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is primarily just cholinergic, right? Sympathetic is going to have some adrenergic and some cholinergic. This means that at the effector site, you're going to have these receptors. So you're going to have an alpha-1 receptor, an alpha-2 receptor, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe not alpha-2 receptor because that's auto and heteroreceptors, but you're going to have alpha-1 receptor, beta-1 receptor, et cetera. Which means that when the norepinephrine or epinephrine goes and acts upon an alpha-1 or alpha-2 receptor, it's going to have a certain activity there. Just like that, when acetylcholine goes and acts on an M2 receptor or an M3 receptor, it's going to have a certain activity there. All right, so remember that alpha-1 is going to be contraction of smooth muscle. Alpha-2 is primarily auto and heteroreceptors. Beta-1 is going to be on the heart primarily. It's going to have some other actions as well, but it's going to be excitatory to the heart. M2 is going to be inhibitory to the heart. Contraction of smooth muscle is going to happen again by M3, and relaxation of smooth muscle is going to happen by beta 2. So you can see both the GQs here are both contracting smooth muscle. And your GS is going to relax smooth muscle. Your GS here, your beta 1 is going to excite your heart, and your GI, your M2. So GI and GS usually have opposite actions. Your GI here is going to inhibit your heart. So that is essentially NM or N1 is at NMJs, and then NNs are at all of your synapses essentially. So that is essentially the penultimate portion of this presentation. And so now we can synthesize this by looking at certain organ systems. So let's take, for example, the eye. The eye has two main parts, two main parts that allow for your vision, your pupil and your lens. I mean, it also has your retina, which transmits that information, et cetera, but your pupil is the one that's letting the light through, and your lens is the one that's focusing that light. Your pupil has some alpha 1 receptors on it. Your pupil also has some muscarinic receptors on it. All right. And based on this, can we tell what these do? Well, if it's alpha 1, so this means it's adrenergic, right? Because cholinergic would be our muscarinics and our nicotinics. So it's adrenergic. The only part of the autonomic nervous system that has adrenergics is your sympathetic. So it's going to be sympathetic action to the pupil. What are we going to want in fight or flight? We're going to want dilation, right? So when we have our norepinephrine or epinephrine going to this alpha 1 receptor, which is a GQ, we're going to have dilation of our pupil. For the muscarinic, for rest and digest, so this is going to be acetylcholine, which is primarily going to be parasympathetic stuff. This is going to be meiosis or pupillary constriction. So this is called meiosis, and this is called mydriasis. Mydriasis. I can spell. Let's look at the lens. So the lens is controlled by the ciliary muscle. And this is going to have some beta receptors. And it's going to have some, and it's going to have some more muscarinic receptors. So beta receptors, so this adrenergic, so it's primarily going to be sympathetic function. When we are in fight or flight, we want to be able to see everything, right? And so the beta receptors, when acted upon by our epinephrine, norepinephrine, are going to relax our ciliary muscle and allow us to see everything. It's going to allow for really far vision. In rest and digest, this is when you're going to curl up with a nice book. Parasympathetic, because it's muscarinic, primarily going to be parasympathetic. This is going to allow for near vision. Okay, and so this is near vision, and this is far vision. Okay, so that's the eye. Let's take another example. Let's take the sinoatrial node of your heart. Okay, and so this is the pacemaker, the primary pacemaker of your heart. Okay, so the sinoatrial node of your heart is going to be under control of both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is going to be under control of beta 1 receptors. So beta 1 receptors, what did we say that was? Well, that's beta 1 is going to be stimulation of the heart. So this is going to allow for increased. And this is adrenergic again, right? So this is primarily going to be sympathetic. Where I'm getting that from is if it's adrenergic, right, it's primarily going to be sympathetic. If it's cholinergic, it's primarily going to be parasympathetic aside from sweat glands. Sweat glands are pretty much the only thing that is cholinergic from the sympathetic standpoint. Okay. So this is where I'm getting, when I say, oh, so that's a M2 or M3, it's going to be cholinergic, it's probably going to be parasympathetic, right? If I see it's alpha or beta, I'm going to say, oh, okay, that's adrenergic, it's probably going to be sympathetic, right? So going back to our example, so SA node, it's going to have some beta 1 receptors. And so beta 1, adrenergic, which means probably going to be sympathetic, which means it's going to raise our heart rate. Or maybe raise our blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're also going to have some muscarinic receptors. So this is going to be parasympathetic, rest and digest. This is going to reduce stimulation to the heart. And finally, let's look at our bladder, which is actually the most interesting one. I saved the best thing for last. Bladder. Our bladder is under sympathetic and parasympathetic control, but it's actually very interesting how it happens. So we have two phases of the bladder. We have filling. So this is from empty all the way to full. And then we have emptying, which happens on full. Okay, so we have filling and full. It's kind of funny how this is controlled because we don't really think about fight or flight as also peeing ourselves. But the full part, the filling part is going to be sympathetic, which is fight or flight. So I don't know who wants to have a full bladder while they're fighting or flighting a bear, but fighting or flighting away from a bear. And the full part is parasympathetic. So I guess we rest with a full bladder, and then we want to excrete it once we've finished running away from the bear. So filling is going to be sympathetic, primarily under sympathetic control, and then full is primarily going to be under parasympathetic control. All right. And this is mediated by both beta 2 and alpha 1 receptors. And full, aka getting rid of everything, is going to be muscarinic receptors. So how does this work? So because we said alpha 1, what does alpha 1 do? Alpha 1 contracts smooth muscle. Okay, so we're going to have some contraction of smooth muscle here. Smooth muscle contraction. But if we contract the smooth muscle of our bladder, we're going to start peeing, right? That's not true. It's because this is going to be a sphincter. And so the sphincter is going to actually keep the fluid within our bladder. It's going to close off the end. All right. But beta 2 is going to be what? Beta 2 is going to be smooth muscle relaxation. Well, if we relax that sphincter, now we're going to start peeing. Well, it's actually acting on a different part. And so this is going to be your detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of your bladder wall. And this is going to relax it. So it lets your bladder fill more freely. So you have beta 2 receptors on your detrusor muscle, which let it relax and which let it fill. And we have alpha 1 receptors on the sphincter, which, when acted upon by epinephrine, norepinephrine, are going to contract it, again, letting it fill, which is under sympathetic control. Now, for the muscarinic, we're going to have the opposite, and this is the parasympathetic action of it. So we're going to have smooth muscle contraction of the detrusor. And as you can imagine, this is probably M3. And we're also going to have smooth muscle relaxation of the internal sphincter. So the bladder is one of the most interesting because it's under so many different controls. It's under sympathetic and parasympathetic control based on which stage of filling or full and excreting you're in. So in the filling stage, you're under sympathetic control. And so your smooth muscle sphincter is contracting and your smooth muscle detrusor is relaxing and letting you fill. This is because it is under sympathetic control and you have the alpha 1 and beta 2 receptors there. Muscarinic receptors, you also have muscarinic receptors on that same thing. So when you have your detrusor muscle, so let's say this is your bladder. So this is going to be your sphincter right here. And this is going to be your detrusor muscle. You're going to have some alpha 1 receptors here and some beta 2 receptors here, but you're also going to have muscarinic receptors here and muscarinic receptors here. So what's going to happen is while you're filling, the norepinephrine is going to be flowing and the epinephrine is going to be flowing and it's going to tell this alpha 1, right? So you have norepinephrine that's floating around and it's going to tell this alpha 1, hey, contract this guy, right? And then it's going to go and attach to the beta 2 receptor and the beta 2 receptor is going to make those cells relax and it's going to relax this guy. So it's going to fill up. But then when the acetylcholine comes around, once you're in rest and digest and you're reading your book and you're looking really close to yourself and you're ready to pee, acetylcholine is going to go wash over these muscarinic receptors and these muscarinic receptors. And when the acetylcholine goes and attaches onto this muscarinic receptor, those cells are going to relax. When it attaches onto these muscarinic receptors, those cells are going to contract and it's going to let you pee. So it can be pretty confusing. Again, this is all for metacognition. So keep in mind that you have all these different types of receptors, and then also keep in mind this chart. And hopefully that'll get you very far. Again, this stuff is all going to be reviewed in your cardiology class as well. This is just to get those ideas flowing around in your brain. All right. So let's see what we went through today. We got through a lot of stuff. Proud of you. Good job sitting through this. I'm sure that most people did not sit through it again. Again, all this stuff is going to be timestamped below. So if you want to review something, go back in and see like, okay, I want to see Gautam tell me about the sympathetic and parasympathetic in particular. I don't remember the anatomical divisions. I want to hear him talk about the cranial nerves, etc. I don't want to hear him ever talk again. I'm going to delete this video from my library. Do whatever you want. But, well, so remember really quick, Costanzo is the name of the book, the physiology book. It's called Costanzo's Physiology. And I highly recommend reading this throughout your first year of medical school. There's a renal chapter, there's a GI chapter. Most of this stuff is coming from chapter 2. And that'll give you, once you've watched this video, now you'll have the background to understand everything in that video. So read this book for like every block. It'll give you a good metacognition of what's existing, and it'll help you organize things in your brain. So let's see what we went through today. Intro, we talked about neurons and nerves. Nerves can be bidirectional, made up of many different neurons. The divisions of the nervous system: afferent stuff going towards, efferent stuff coming away. You have the peripheral nerves and the central nerves. Central nervous system. Central nervous system: brain, brainstem, spinal cord, from which the peripheral nerves arise. So peripheral nerves will bring the sensory information in. It'll go up and down your spinal cord tracts and then get to your brain. The efferent information will go down your spinal cord tracts and then go out into your peripheral nerves, let you do your stretching and all that kind of stuff, which we should have done more of during this session. And it'll also let you do autonomic functions that we're not really thinking about. Sympathetic and parasympathetic, those are the autonomic functions, and we went through those in particular, as well as the different receptors and the different neurotransmitters. So sympathetic is primarily going to be adrenergic, a little bit of cholinergic, mostly adrenergic, which means norepinephrine and epinephrine at the effector sites, and it's going to act upon alpha and beta receptors. Parasympathetic, primarily going to function on muscarinic receptors, and it's usually going to have acetylcholine at the effector sites. In between, at the ganglia, it's mostly going to be acetylcholine, except for the somatic, which is going to have glutamate from the upper motor neuron to lower motor neuron junction. Ganglia are just the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons, where the preganglionic neurons synapse onto the postganglionic neurons. Sympathetic nerves have the ganglia right next to the vertebral body, the vertebral column, and parasympathetic have the ganglia all the way next to the effector site, which makes the preganglionic of the parasympathetic super long. Preganglionic sympathetic is super short, and then you get the postganglionic being super long. We went through the 12 cranial nerves, what each of them do, the sensory functions, some of the motor functions. 4 of them have parasympathetic function: 3, 7, 9, and 10. We went through the spinal cord tracts. This is where the information is ascending and descending within the spinal cord. This is going to be motor information through the corticospinal tracts. It's going to be sensory information through the spinothalamic tract, so ascending information through the spinothalamic, and the DCML, dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. This is the stuff that's dorsal column, so it's the posterior tract. If it gets attacked by a bear, it doesn't really matter. It's all the useless stuff, such as proprioception, hair sense, vibration, etc. Then we spoke about the receptors and GPCRs. So going back to the sympathetic and parasympathetic, we have adrenergic, sympathetic at the effector junction. We have cholinergic, parasympathetic at the effector junction. Acetylcholine, cholinergic, is primarily going to act upon the muscarinic and nicotinic receptors. Adrenergic is going to primarily act upon the alpha and beta receptors. And then we spoke about the implications in organ systems, especially the bladder. That's a really important one to review. Again, if you want more information on this, go and check out Chapter 2 of Costanzo. It'll give you a lot of good information. Hopefully this provided a little bit of a metacognitive framework for you. Hopefully it was a little bit helpful. I know my voice is sore now, but it was a great review for me as well. So thank you for watching. Thank you for taking the time. And I wish you the best in your medical school career. Have a good one.